welcome to your personalized deep dive. This one is focused on Michelle Alexander's The New Jim Crow. We're going to be focusing on chapters 3 and 4. And these chapters really look at how race, criminal justice, and social exclusion all intersect in the United States. Get ready, because it's pretty eye-opening.
It is, yeah. I think, we're going to be talking about some hard truths about how this system really impacts people.
Yeah.
Particularly within communities of color who, are labeled as criminals.
Okay.
Yeah.
So let's jump right in. Alexander starts off by talking about this idea of policing the enemy. And she's really getting at, how racial bias is baked into the way that law enforcement operates.
Yeah, and one of the things that she points out is just how much power police officers have, especially when it comes to drug offenses. They have a lot of discretion in terms of who they stop, who they search, and ultimately who they arrest.
So are you saying that even if drug use is happening across all communities, police are choosing to focus on certain neighborhoods more than others?
That's exactly what Alexander argues. She points to the war on drugs as a prime example. Drug use is fairly evenly spread across racial demographics, but the brunt of the enforcement has fallen on poor Black and brown communities.
Yeah, it's hard for me to imagine SWAT teams, busting down doors in wealthy white suburbs with the same kind of intensity that we see in Black neighborhoods.
Right, and Alexander digs into why that is. She talks about hyper-segregation, which is essentially extreme racial segregation.
Right.
It's the legacy of policies like redlining that, kept Black families concentrated in certain areas. And because of that, those communities become easy targets for police scrutiny.
So because of past discriminatory practices, these communities are more heavily policed, which leads to more arrests, more convictions, and then that just feeds into these existing stereotypes. It's like a self-fulfilling prophecy.
You got it. And it's not just anecdotal. Alexander highlights a study in Seattle that debunked the idea that police were simply focusing on high-crime areas. So researchers found that even when the facts contradicted stereotypes, Seattle police still concentrated on crack cocaine, which we know is a drug that has been heavily associated with Black communities.
Wait, so even when there was evidence that other drugs were more prevalent in white communities, the focus stayed on crack.
Yeah.
It seems like race was a bigger factor than actual crime rates.
That's the conclusion that Alexander draws, yeah. She connects this to what she calls the circular logic of racial profiling.
Okay.
So high arrest rates in Black communities are used to justify more aggressive policing.
Right.
But those high rates are often the result of biased policing in the first place.
It's like this vicious cycle.
It is.
Yeah. Okay, so that's disturbing. But what about legal protections? Doesn't the Constitution protect against racial discrimination?
You would think so, right?
Yeah.
But Alexander points to Supreme Court rulings like United States v. Brignoni-Ponce, which actually allow police to use race as a factor in stops and searches.
Wait, I'm confused. So the highest court in the land, which is supposed to guarantee equal protection under the law, is saying it's okay to consider race when deciding who to stop.
Yeah, it's definitely a head-scratcher. And the justification is that race can be a factor, but not the sole factor.
Right.
But Alexander argues that this is a very flimsy defense. In reality, bias is rarely so clear-cut. It seeps into decisions in much more subtle ways.
It's like saying we don't discriminate. We just happen to notice race along with other things.
Yeah.
It seems like a way to get around the spirit of anti-discrimination laws.
Exactly. And then you have the case of Alexander v. Sandoval, which really kind of closed the door on legal challenges to racial profiling. It essentially made it much harder to prove discrimination in court.
So even if there's evidence of racial bias, the legal system makes it almost impossible to fight back. That's disheartening.
Unfortunately, that's the reality that Alexander lays out.
Yeah.
So you have these court cases combined with this discretion given to police officers. It creates a system that is ripe for abuse. And the consequences for those who are caught in the system are really devastating.
So what happens to people once they're labeled as criminals? What kind of challenges do they face?
Alexander argues that in the U.S., being labeled a criminal is almost like experiencing a civic death. Former prisoners lose basic rights and opportunities. She compares it to what freed slaves experienced after the Civil War. So it's like being punished twice, first by the prison sentence and then by a society that shuts you out.
It's like a double whammy. You do the time, but then you're still branded a criminal, and that prevents you from fully re-entering society.
Right. And Alexander doesn't just talk about this in broad strokes. She really gets into the nitty-gritty. of how difficult reintegration is, and she starts with housing.
Oh, yeah. I can see how that would be a huge issue. Like, if you've got a criminal record, who's going to want to rent to you?
Well, and it's not just about, individual landlords. Like, there are a lot of roadblocks that are actually built into the system. Alexander points to laws like the Anti-Drug Abuse Act of 1988 and Clinton's one-strike policy. And these laws make it nearly impossible for ex-offenders to get access to stable housing.
But couldn't someone just find a private landlord? Who's willing to give them a chance?
It's not always that simple. A lot of private landlords use these blanket policies that automatically disqualify anyone with a criminal record. And even if you can find a place, there's this thing called a no-fault clause.
No fault.
Yeah, in some public housing leases.
What does that mean?
So that means that you can be evicted for a crime committed by a family member or a guest, even if you had absolutely no knowledge of it.
So, like, let's say, hypothetically, your grandson gets caught with drugs.
Yeah.
You could be evicted, even if you had no idea he was involved with anything illegal.
That's exactly right.
Wow. So you're telling me that you could lose your home because of something your grandson did, even if you were totally in the dark?
Yeah, it's incredibly unfair, but it is a reality for a lot of people.
Yeah, that seems very unfair.
And it creates this constant fear and uncertainty for people who are trying to rebuild their lives.
Right.
If you don't have stable housing, it's very difficult to successfully reintegrate.
It's like setting people up to fail. You get out of prison and you're trying to turn things around,
Yeah.
but you can't even find a place to live.
It's true. And it doesn't stop there. Alexander goes on to talk about employment.
Oh, yeah.
Having a criminal record can be a huge barrier to finding a job.
Right. I've seen those, check the box questions on job applications. And it just feels like once you check that box, you're automatically disqualified.
It's almost like that box becomes a scarlet letter. It instantly changes the way employers see you.
Yeah.
And Alexander cites statistics that show that only 40% of employers are open to hiring someone with a criminal record. But here's the kicker. 90% said they'd be willing to hire someone on welfare.
Wait, so society is more accepting of someone who needs government assistance than someone who's made a mistake in the past? That seems backwards.
It is, isn't it? And there's another layer to this. So Alexander talks about what she calls spatial mismatch,
Okay.
which basically means that a lot of jobs are located far away from the communities where ex-offenders are released back to. So that creates all these transportation challenges.
So even if you can overcome the stigma of having a record
Yeah.
and you find someone willing to hire you, then physically getting to work can be another hurdle. It's like one obstacle after another.
It really is a system that's, designed to keep people trapped. And on top of all that, many ex-offenders are saddled with this mountain of debt.
Yeah.
Fines, fees, restitution, child support. It all adds up.
Yeah, it's crazy because you're trying to start over, but you're already drowning in debt.
Alexander calls this a modern-day debtor's prison. And she shares the story of Oral Lee Hurley, who worked a full-time job but was still incarcerated because she couldn't pay off her fines.
So you're telling me you could be working, contributing to society,
Yeah.
but still be locked up because of debt.
That's the reality for a lot of people.
Just doesn't seem right.
It's a cruel irony. And to make matters worse, you might also be denied public assistance.
Denied assistance. But what if you're like struggling to make ends meet?
Yeah, well, welfare reform legislation often prevents people with drug-related felonies from receiving food stamps, sometimes for life. It doesn't matter if you're trying to turn your life around. This system basically says, you made a mistake, now you're on your own.
That's just heartless.
Yeah.
It seems to go against the very idea of helping people who are down on their luck.
Yeah, it raises some serious questions about what we value as a society. Is it just about punishment? Or is it also about rehabilitation and giving people a chance to reintegrate?
Right, right. It seems like we've created this system that makes it nearly impossible for people to move on from their past.
That's one of Alexander's main arguments for sure. And she also points out that it's not just about material barriers like housing and employment. There's a deeper, more insidious consequence. And that's the psychological and social impact of being labeled a criminal.
You mean like the shame and the stigma that come with having a record?
Alexander uses the check the box question on job applications as a really powerful analogy.
Right.
It's not just about being rejected for the job. It's the way people look at you differently.
Yeah.
The judgment in their eyes, that subtle shift in their demeanor.
Yeah, I can imagine how dehumanizing that must feel. Like you're instantly reduced to your worst mistake.
And you become defined by this label. And Alexander talks about how this shame often prevents open discussion about mass incarceration. People suffer in silence, afraid to talk about their experiences or seek support.
It creates this feeling of isolation, like you're the only one going through it.
Right, and that's what Alexander calls pluralistic ignorance. So people are unaware of how widespread the problem is.
They think they're alone in their shame, which makes it even harder to break free.
It's like this vicious cycle of silence and stigma. But there's also this idea that in some communities, mass incarceration is so common that it's become normalized. So does that mean that people aren't ashamed of it anymore?
That's a great question, and Alexander argues that it's not that simple. Even if incarceration becomes statistically normal,
Right.
it doesn't mean that people are okay with it.
So how do people reconcile this disconnect between like what's statistically common and what's socially acceptable?
Well, Alexander suggests that gangster culture can be seen as a way of coping with the stigma. It's a way to carve out a positive identity in a world where you're constantly bombarded with negative stereotypes.
It's like reclaiming the narrative, finding a way to feel powerful when the system has stripped you of so much power.
Exactly. But Alexander's careful not to romanticize this.
Right.
She points out that gangster rap, for example, often perpetuates these harmful stereotypes for the entertainment of a largely white audience.
Yeah. So it's like a modern day minstrel show in a way, profiting from Black pain.
So it's complex because on the one hand, you have people who are trying to find dignity and agency in a system that's designed to dehumanize them. But on the other hand, it can end up reinforcing these harmful stereotypes.
It's a really tough situation. And there are no easy answers. But Alexander's point is that, we can't just dismiss gangster culture as something that's inherently negative. We need to understand the deeper social forces that are shaping it.
It goes back to that idea of understanding the context.
Yeah.
We can't separate the individual from the system that they're embedded in.
Absolutely. And Alexander's book is all about exposing that system, showing how it operates on multiple levels, from laws and policies to social norms and cultural representations.
One of the things that struck me was how she connects the dots between historical systems of racial control, like Jim Crow, and the modern era of mass incarceration.
Right, it's a brilliant insight. She argues that mass incarceration is in many ways a reincarnation of Jim Crow. It uses the criminal justice system to create and maintain a racial caste system.
A caste system. Are you saying that in America? Your race can determine your place in society, even if we don't explicitly acknowledge it.
That's exactly what Alexander's arguing. And the prison label becomes the new mark of that caste. It's like a badge of inferiority that follows you for life. It limits your opportunities, and it shapes how others perceive you.
It's like that self-fulfilling prophecy again.
Yeah.
You're labeled a criminal, you're denied opportunities, and then you're pushed right back into the system.
Exactly. It's a vicious cycle, fueled by silence and fear. And Alexander argues that breaking this silence is crucial for dismantling this system.
So how do we start breaking the silence?
Well, it begins with acknowledging the problem,
Having
open and honest conversations about race, class, and justice in America.
Yeah, it feels like we're talking about this societal taboo, People just don't want to talk about mass incarceration. It's easier to just look away.
It's definitely easier to ignore it, but as Alexander points out, that silence is part of what allows the system to persist. It's like this shroud of secrecy that protects the status quo.
So what can we do about it? What are the steps we can take to address this issue?
Well, Alexander argues for a complete shift in our approach to justice. She believes that we need to move away from a purely punitive system, one that's all about punishment, and embrace a more restorative model.
Restore, what does that mean?
So restorative justice, it's a way of looking at crime that recognizes the harm done to individuals and communities.
Okay.
So instead of just focusing on punishing the offender, restorative justice seeks to repair the damage and bring about healing.
That sounds pretty different from the way our current system works. Can you give me a concrete example of what that might look like in practice?
Sure. So imagine a scenario where someone commits a burglary in a restorative justice model. You might have a meeting that brings together the victim, the offender, and members of the community.
And what would be the purpose of a meeting like that?
Well, it's a chance for the victim to express the impact the crime has had on their life, the fear, the sense of violation, the financial loss, and the offender gets to take responsibility for their actions, to hear firsthand how their choices have affected others.
So it's not just about throwing someone in jail and calling it a day.
Right.
It's about addressing the root causes of the crime and finding a way to make things right.
Exactly. It's a much more holistic approach, and it recognizes that accountability doesn't always have to mean punishment. It can also mean making amends, finding ways to give back to the community.
Okay, but I'm still trying to wrap my head around this. What if the crime is violent? Can you really repair the harm in a situation like that?
That's a really valid question, and it's important to acknowledge that restorative justice isn't a magic bullet.
Yeah.
It's not appropriate for every situation, and it definitely takes a lot of work, but there are examples of it being used successfully, even in cases of violent crime.
So how would that work?
Well, it might involve victim-offender dialogues, where the victim has a chance to confront the person who harmed them and ask questions. And this can be incredibly powerful for both parties. The victim gets to express their pain and receive an apology, and the offender gets to understand the consequences of their actions and begin to make amends.
That sounds really intense, but I could see how it could be a step towards healing.
Yeah, it's not about forgetting or condoning what happened. It's about finding a way to move forward. Restorative justice also recognizes the importance of community involvement. So there might be community service projects or other forms of restitution that allow the offender to give back and demonstrate their commitment to change.
So it's about shifting the focus from punishment to rehabilitation and reintegration. It seems like a huge cultural shift from the way our current system operates.
It is a big shift, but Alexander argues that it's a necessary one. She believes that we need to start investing in alternatives to incarceration, things like drug treatment, mental health services, job training programs.
Yeah, it makes sense to address the underlying issues that contribute to crime, rather than just reacting after the fact. It's like we've been putting a Band-Aid on a gaping wound.
Exactly. And one of the most important things we can do is challenge the narratives that support mass incarceration. This idea that more prisons equals more safety is simply not true.
It seems like we've become obsessed with punishment without really thinking about the long-term consequences.
Alexander's work is a powerful reminder that we can't just lock people up and expect the problems to go away. We have to be willing to invest in real solutions to create a system that's truly just and equitable.
So what does this all mean for our listeners? What can they do on an individual level to help bring about this change?
Well, first and foremost, education is key. Read Alexander's book, learn about restorative justice, and start questioning the narratives you've been fed about crime and punishment.
Knowledge is power, right?
Right.
Once you understand how the system works, you're better equipped to challenge it.
Exactly. And don't be afraid to have those difficult conversations with family and friends. Share what you've learned, challenge stereotypes, and start shifting the conversation in your own circles.
It's about raising awareness,
Yeah.
making people understand the true human cost of mass incarceration.
Absolutely. And it's about action. Get involved with organizations working for criminal justice reform support candidates who are advocating for change, and use your voice to demand a more just and equitable system.
I love that it's a reminder that we're not powerless. We all have a role to play in creating a better world.
That's exactly the message Alexander leaves us with her book, is a call to action, a challenge to confront uncomfortable truths and commit to building a better future.
This deep dive has been quite a journey. We've explored the dark side of the criminal justice system, the ways in which it perpetuates racial inequality and undermines our values as a society. But we've also uncovered a glimmer of hope. We've learned about alternative approaches to justice, the power of restorative practices, and the importance of individual action. So as you go forward, I encourage you to reflect on what you've learned today. What resonated with you, what surprised you, and most importantly, what will you do to make a difference?
Remember, the fight for justice is a fight for all of us. Let's continue to learn, to challenge, and to act together.